The World of RPGs, Episode 28, France, Part 2. Welcome to The World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host, Mo Bartz, and I always record these intros new. I don't know why, that's kind of being lazy. Anyways, we're returning to France because this is part 2 of a 3-part episode, and if you haven't listened to the first part yet, perhaps start with that one. And we get right back to the interviews because this is a big one. And we start with some more info on actual plays and conventions. One comment beforehand, my interviewee mentions a Francophone game called La Collection Max Brown, and that's actually from Switzerland.
So I'm a Pashansky. For real, in real life, day to day, I'm a filmmaker and editor, and then I do TTRPGs. It used to be for fun, and now somehow has become a little part of my job as well. So I got into TTRPGs by playing D&D with a group of uni friends, which is I think how a lot of us got into TTRPGs in general. But since then, I've fallen really in love with the actual play scene. And so even though I do still play for fun with my friends as a hobby, I also run an actual play channel, and then I also get involved with the actual play scene and just a general storytelling scene in France to do with TTRPGs. And that's kind of the story.
And which games do you play currently?
So that's a trick question for me because the game I play privately is D&D, but I don't play that on actual play. Very specifically, I don't think it's the best game for actual play. That is a controversial opinion, but that is what I think in my heart of heart. And I play basically everything that isn't D&D. So I've played in Die RPG, I've played Cats, which is a French game, I've played A City of Mist, I've played Avatar, I've played Kids on Bikes, Kids on Brooms, just truly anything that is not D&D is something I'm interested in. And as long as there's good potential for interesting storytelling, then I'm interested in playing it.
And your actual play channel is actually in English, isn't it?
It is, yes. The actual play channel that I co-run with my best friend Amberine is called Blanket Fort RPG, and it is in English, even though I'm based in France, I'm French.
And also one reason why we're talking is you also GM'd the English version of Cats the Conspiracy. So in other interviews, we talked a lot about the game. The French version and in English edition has been crowdfunded. So there I'll also link to the session where you run it with the role and play people in English. So how did that happen?
So that was my kind of entry point to the TTRPG world in France. I had been a fan. I'd watched Roll and Play before, and I ended up in a Discord server with Laura, the producer of Roll and Play. And I posted on that Discord about Blanket Fort, and then she reached out to me and was like, hey, we're interested in running something in English. Would you be interested? And we met and we got along. Should have just been a player. And then I ended up GMing and writing the scenario, and then Black Book published the scenario in French as well. So it was all a big kind of fast introduction, but I got introduced very quickly to a lot of very important people, and it was a dream. Honestly, the table was incredible, just a bunch of incredibly talented actors and actresses, and had a blast.
Can you say something about the scenario without spoiling it?
Yeah, of course. So the synopsis is there's cats, a bunch of cats, hundreds of them, gather around museums around the world. And it's all a bit scary for the masquerade because obviously it looks weird to humans. And if humans start looking into cats, then they might uncover the masquerade. And that's impossible in the world of cats. You're not allowed to let the masquerade slip by. So the players get sent as agents of the masquerade to investigate this weird phenomenon, why the cat. So they get sent to the New York Met, and they have to investigate and figure out why all the cats are being drawn to museums and make it stop.
And there are a couple of French RPGs based on cats. Is that like a common theme in France?
I don't know. I think it's a common theme of the world. I feel like I don't really know why specifically in France. There's a lot of creativity around games in France, I think. Like when you think of the board game industry even, it's very powerful here. Like I'd say second to Germany, and then that's about it. They want to look for interesting things that haven't been done before. And I think cats is just a popular theme in general that feels like a safe bet, but hadn't really been done well yet as a TTRPG. So I think maybe that's where that comes from.
In the French RPG scene, you've also been involved in conventions. Can you maybe say a bit about those?
Yeah. So in France, there's a very big TTRPG convention called Octogone, which happens once a year. And it's just this massive group of people who do, it's TTRPGs, but it's also war games. There's a bit of board games. It's over 2 to 3 day weekend. It used to be 24 hours, like open overnight. So people would come in and like sleep at the convention and like play games until 3 a.m. That was kind of the point of it. It's changed locations this year, so I'm not entirely sure if this year is still open 24/7, like the 24 hours throughout the whole weekend. But yeah, so they reached out to me after the Cats thing, looking for people to judge their TTRPG of the Year award, which is kind of important. They're trying to make it more important over the years. It's gaining traction for sure. And basically what it is they send emails to all of the major publishers, and the publishers send in their manuscripts or their PDFs of games that have come out that year. And then a bunch of people, so there's 8 of us, read through all of them, and then we decide our favorite. So last year it was about 35 games, I think. And so we read through, then we have meetings with the rest of the jury, then we have like a list of criteria that stays kind of secret because we don't want to have to explain everything to everyone, but it's your regular thing. There's nothing really special in those criteria. And then we talk and we decide our favorite, we discuss. So first we pick our kind of 3 favorites and we nominate them, and then we announce on the day at the convention which one has won. And I was there for the first time last year, and this year's a bit different because they changed the way that the convention is done, and so there was less time. Not enough games came out for us to really do this, so we changed the format a little bit, and we're just looking at GM screens this year. That's just for this year very specifically. It's going to go back to being about the actual full games next year.
Oh, I was going to ask you for the games of this year, but if they're just GM screens, that's not that interesting. But maybe who was the winner last year?
So the winner last year was my favorite. I pushed for it a lot. It was a game called Wilder Feast, which is a game that came out in America first, was crowdfunded. Then the translation was crowdfunded in French. And I just loved it. The art was so beautiful. There was a lot of discussion about it, mostly because the creators, we had games that were entirely French, where the creators were French, the studio was French, everything was French. And for this one, obviously, because it was an adaptation, it was a translation, people felt that maybe we weren't recognizing French talent, but at the end of the day, we gave it to the best game, and that was that one. But there were other games that were nominated that were French and also very good. So that was the game that won, Wilder Feast. It's a game where you play as hunters, and it's a game in 4 phases. And basically the pitch is you're in a world and there's a big kind of disease that's ravaging all of the animals, and you're meant to be a population that really loves the animals, but these animals are awful and they're starting to attack villages. So you have to go and kill the specific diseased animals, and then you have to cook them and eat them. And that is a huge part of the game, because the animals that you eat influence your like character development. So if you kill a crab, you can then eat the crab, and then you'll grow like a crab claw. And then your character forever has a crab claw in combat and stuff like that. I really loved it. I thought it was very visual. And as somebody who cares about actual play, that is something I care about. There was a lot of space for role playing in it as well. So yeah, that's the one that won last year. We split it into 2 categories. One of them was Francophone and one of them was international. That's how we fixed this.
I just checked on the website and it seems to be an Italian game.
Ooh, yeah, maybe. I wouldn't be surprised.
I haven't done the Italy episode yet, but I'm also a bit scared of it because there's so much there. But Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Sweden are the big non-English speaking RPG scenes. And so for Germany, I had like 12 interviews. Italy will also probably escalate a bit.
But I guess for Germany, at least, everyone you're going to try to interview will know how to speak English properly.
And were there noteworthy French games from last year?
For the French games, the one that won was a game called The Collection Max Brown, which was really cool and had like a lot of lore built into it that felt not too difficult, to do with like you were on a quest to collect magical items that had some sort of dark magic into it. But the thing that I really liked was that you deck built. There was an element of deck building, like narrative deck building that evolved with your character that felt really well done. And I really liked it. So that's the other one that won.
As far as I can tell, that game was funded on Game on Tabletop. And I think that's a French company, isn't it?
Yes, it's Laura's company.
Usually in the international space, we have Kickstarter and GameFound. But then in Western Europe, there's also a Game on Tabletop. In your actual place, you've done English games, and then, of course, French games. And as you just explained, there was the convention. You also had like the international games and the French ones. Do you notice any differences between the games from different countries?
Yes and no. I think there is, and I wouldn't really know how to explain it, but I do feel like there is a kind of flavor to French creations. I think the quality is similar. I think there's not one that's better than the other. I think they're done to the same standard, if that makes sense. But I do think there's something how do I put this? I think there's a bit more freedom to explore in French games. I think from what I saw, obviously I haven't read everything, but from the stuff I read last year and the stuff I've read for myself, I do think in publishing in English-speaking countries, there's so much competition that a lot of times it's easier to play it a bit safe. Whereas I think with the Francophone games, and especially as well because the board game industry here is so rich and big, it's a bit easier to innovate with mechanics, to innovate with lore, to innovate with all of that. So I don't think one is better than the other. Don't get me wrong. I don't think French games are better than international games or American games or whatever. I just think there's a level of risk taking that is maybe a bit easier, again, because the market isn't as big, the competition isn't as big, so the risk isn't as big. You're not risking everything by trying something new here. Whereas I do think if I look at the list of last year's awards, a lot of the games that we nominated for the international category are kind of samey, whereas all of the games from the Francophone category are very different. And it's not something we did on purpose. It's just from the list of games that we got, I do think it's a bit easier in France to try things out.
Yeah, the first French game I ever held in my hands was a boxed set. And as far as I understand, and it was a local game from Bordeaux, and apparently you play insects who have adventures, and it's mostly card-based. And it looked really amazing design-wise, but it was also quite weird. And I mean, not humanoid insects, but like insects in a garden.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Like, obviously, there's a lot of people who do indie stuff in the Anglophone scene for sure, but there's a huge indie scene in France, and it's very popular. So there's people like Melville, for example, who's even popular abroad. Like I was on a jury for international games 3 years ago, and there were a few games from Melville in there. But yeah, I think there's also, again, with the risk-taking stuff, there's also people who are willing to do a lot of indie things and like try stuff out that's never been done before and stuff like that without the pressure of even the publishing industry of having to make any money off of it. And so I think that kind of takes everybody to weirder areas. Like, it does push the publishing industry to try weirder things because the indie scene is so strong.
A mentioned the vibrant indie scene, so let's hear from an indie author and podcaster. We'll also learn more about the games by Melville and also mainstream games from France.
My alias is Locus Solus. My real first name is Thomas. And I got into role-playing games when I was a child, quite young actually, like around maybe 7 or 8 years old, and it was my cousin. I think the first game we played, well, it was actually a German game, The Black Eye. And after that, I bought my own games like MERP, Middle-earth role-playing game, and then went on with things like Star Wars and so on. So I played, I would say, from age 8 to like something around maybe 25. Then I stopped for like more than 10 years maybe and went back into the hobby. Well, mainly because I saw videos on YouTube from guys that were talking about the hobby, and I saw that the hobby really evolved during the time I was kind of away from it, with things like all the tools to bring the expectations of the players around the table together. All those reasons, because I think before I had some kind of frustration about that because of misaligned expectations. I think sometimes between the different players and me, I saw there are tools like that. And also, after I went back to the hobby, just like as a player and a game master and so on, I also went on writing my own adventures and my own games because I like to write. I've been writing for a long time, usually short stories, things like that. And I told myself, well, why not writing for the TTRPG adventures and TTRPG games?
And then let's go to your games. Can you say maybe a bit about what kind of games these are and maybe give a short overview of a few of them?
I write both adventures for games. Usually when I write an adventure, there is the system included inside, the rules. I don't like write adventures for other games. And I also write standalone games. And I think they reflect what I like to play, and which is a lot of different things. I like the variety in a role-playing game. I like to change very often. I play like what I call traditional games, also OSR, also GMLess games, really all sorts of games, and I write all sorts of games also. So on Lulu, you have Biome, which is an adventure, traditional for like a GM, and I think it's 4 players. It's a sci-fi adventure. It's kind of space age adventure, but industrialized space age. And it's, kind of horrific. It looks like Alien a little, actually. It's the main inspiration. And the games are very different. So this is an adventure with a system included. This adventure was published under Clean Crew label. So I think you interviewed them. That's why Cedric made the layout and the art. The 2 other games are without labels, are really self-published, I would say. It is in French, Ce que la mer nous apporte. So what the sea brings us, it's also an adventure with a self-contained system. And it's more a fantasy adventure. And the last one, Papillon Tonnerre, so Butterfly Thunder, is a game. It's not an adventure, it's really a game. It's still a game with a GM, but I will still label it as an alternative game. It has, I would say, not so traditional mechanics and a way to structure the narration and the way the different scenes occurs that has specific mechanics.
Can you say something about these mechanics?
So basically, it's a game of time travel. The players play people from an alternative timeline, and those people in this timeline, they travel to other timelines to change things in past histories. But when they travel to those alternative timelines, they travel inside a host. It's like a flesh vehicle that they use. The different players are just playing like spirits inside this flesh vehicle. They take decisions together, but they have like only one body to act on their missions. And also the game alternates scenes that are occurring in their target timeline, the things that they are trying to change, like they are mission scenes, okay? And they alternate with other scenes that are called relation scenes that are developing the relationships between those different travelers, which are traveling as spirit in a single body. And also their relation with this body, this person who is lending his or her body for them to travel with. And this person in this scene is played by the GM, actually. So it's traditional, but not so, as you can see, because the GM is also playing like a super important non-player character. And the mechanic is just there. You have a kind of mechanic of like checks to check that your player can succeed or fail in their action, but it's mainly used to change the value of a gauge. And when this gauge comes to 0, you have to play relationship scene to kind of maintain all those spirits and this body together. It's a time travel / relationship and control. It's a game about relationships and control, basically.
These are the 3 that are available in print, but you have some other digitally. Is any game there you want to point out?
Maybe not, because there are a lot, but what I can say is basically the idea of what I publish as a PDF only, as digital material, is that they are pay what you want, and there are different formats. There's a thinking about the format that I want to distribute freely, or as pay what you want, which can be free if you pay nothing, and the format that I distribute at a cost. Because when I print something, if you want it, it's print on demand, you have to pay. So I cannot distribute it freely. I mean, I could in conventions and so on, but if you want to buy it like in a shop or on the internet, you have to pay for it. But for the digital content, I do not have this constraint, so I can distribute material freely. But also, it means that it cannot be anything in terms of format, because I think like if you have a big game like Biome, okay, it's maybe 60 pages, A4 when it's printed. I think it's far more convenient to have it physically to read it. So when I distribute free games as PDF, I also think about the fact that they are usable as PDF, so that the links are well made, and that also it's not too long, because reading, I think, more than 20 pages on the screen can be tedious, and or also as print and play. For instance, I have a game that is a GMLS game that is called Slices, and this game is like A4, like 2 pages, so you can print it and play it. I would say the two, what I distribute as print on demand and as PDF digital only, it's really two different kind of offers. And it's more about the format and the way it will be used. It's not about the quality. I don't spend like much less time on what I distribute freely than on what I distribute at a cost.
And these are all in French?
Yes.
Do you think there's any game or an element in a game that connects to French culture in some way?
That's interesting. I would say no. Generally, it's not about, French history or things like that. But there are themes, for sure, that come back very often. And there are also, I think, an angle, like a kind of political point of view. There's often in my work, there are like a sense of community, kind of also communities that are self-managed or that are struggling against something more powerful than them. You have that in Biome. In Biome, there is a strike on the space station when the games begin. So like those social, political matters or themes are really coming back often in my games. Not only, but there is also another game that I'm writing. I'm doing the layout currently that is called Deep Sun, Soleil Profond in French. It's an OSR game, but it's really about ecological themes. I have another game that is free that is called Lettres de la République errante, so Letters from the Wandering Republic, which is a game about pirate utopia. So yeah, those matters like social struggle, anarchism, self-managed communities is something that you see a lot in my work. So maybe you could qualify it as French culture, but I don't think it's like specifically French. Like you have that in other countries.
I mean, as someone who grew up in Germany, strikes are something we associate more with France than with Germany because of different work organization culture. French work organization is more confrontational, and that rather leads to strikes. And German work culture is more trying to get compromises, and that leads to less strikes. Anyway, that might be cultural, actually. And you're also working with someone else on a podcast. Maybe you can say a bit about that.
The guy I'm co-hosting the podcast with is called Brocknar. And we are co-hosting a podcast that is called Otium. So Otium is a Latin word for like the free time. What do you do when you are not like doing business? So in Latin, like the business is the negation of Otium. So it's neg Otium. In French, you talk about négoce is also a word for business. And in Roman times was dedicated to, of course, leisure, but also political and social thinking. Okay, thinking about something else. And this podcast, it's about the TTRPG and the messages that are conveyed by different TTRPGs. We have a very political point of view, okay? Because it's kind of a reaction, really, because we saw a lot of people in the TTRPG scene in France that are defining themselves as non-political, apolitical. And we think it's wrong, not that it is wrong to not express political opinion. You don't have to always express political opinion. But we think at Otium that when you create something, a work for a specific medium, like TTRPG, but it could be music, it could be cinema, it could be books, anything, it necessarily conveys some political views. So it was kind of a reaction to say, okay, the TTRPG, even those that are advertising that there's no political message, it's not a political game, it in fact is. I mean, at least the minimal message, it conveys it that we don't see the world as a place where it is important to express political point of view, which is in itself a political view. Okay? because it means that you will not basically go against what's already in place. It's of course a political point of view. So basically that's it. And to be clear and honest, and the guy that is hosting the podcast with me is also a leftist like me. We are kind of anarchist, I would say. Yeah, that's all about this podcast. So there's already, I think, something like 8 episodes already available. And sometimes it's just the two of us and we discuss about a subject. And sometimes we have a guest.
I would agree that many role-playing games have certain political messages in them, even if they don't directly say it. For example, representation of groups or how organizations or governments are envisaged in the game or how that's kind of shown in the rules is a decision of the author, and it doesn't happen from nowhere because the author, of course, decides like how does he want to portray a kingdom. And I was wondering, did you also discuss French games in there?
Yes, but like not only. It's like among others, when we are talking about a specific subject, there are some games that are relevant for the subject. And in this game, there can be English games, French games. And we have also the material mostly in TTRPG now with the internet that you can order from different countries and so on. It's mainly you have English, but we also have a lot of French TTRPGs. And we also have a lot of French translation of RPGs from different languages. So that's something we see a lot in France. And not only like for Dungeons and Dragons, for a lot of different English or German or other games.
Yes, when I was in Bordeaux in 2023, I tried to count the games in the shop, and I think they had like 20 or 30 games translated from English, and then like 20 or 30 unique French games. So there's quite a lot. And I was wondering, are there any specific French games that you talked about that show any specific messages or that were interesting in that sense?
Oh yes, there is. Maybe the more radical one was a game called Insurrection. So The Insurrection by Melville, which is a GM-less game that is talking about, so basically an insurrection that is happening. In the game, you can have the different point of views. You play different things. So it's a GM-less game that is inspired by Bob games, so Belonging, Outside Belonging. So those are games where you play your own character, but you also play like a part of the universe, of the setting. And when you play part of the settings, you also play the police, the power, the government, and so on. So you build something with a big variety of point of views. And it's very interesting for this also, and for understanding the mechanics behind the insurrection and the way that they can be repressed or not, and the way that your character is trying to express his views or her views really to exist. So yeah, this one is quite a strong message, I would say. There is one that is interesting by the same author. So Melville is really creating games with strong messages usually. So that's why I'm talking about this work. There's another game that is called Bois Dormant, so Sleeping Wood, where it's like a kind of post-apocalyptic game. It's also GM-less. I think already in the form of the game, having a GM-less game is already a political message, kind of. And you play important members like pillars of self-sustained community that is trying to survive in this post-apocalyptic world where cities are like abandoned and the majority of the population is sleeping. They have a kind of strange like illness and they always sleep. So you have to tend for them, to feed them and so on. There's this load to manage and trying to understand what's happening and so on. So very interesting game. In fact, the game is called Bois Dormant, and in French, the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty is called La Belle au Bois Dormant. That's why. So that's why you have people, like maybe half the population that is sleeping. That's the reason. Games by Melville, very strong messages usually.
But that's more like an indie game, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are there any mainstream games from France which stood out to you in that regard?
Yes. Well, again, it depends what you call mainstream. But yes, let's define it. Indie for me is really kind of self-published. Or maybe you have the help, but with a really limited number of people. So that would be indie games. But yeah, I think about one game that is published by it's not a big company, but it's a publisher that is called Arcane Asylum. I don't know if I would say it's not like a big publisher, but still they are translating a lot of big mainstream games, like a lot of games from Free Leagues, Alien, Mutant, Tales from the Loop, games like that. Also, they translated Cult also. So they have like big games. They are also publishing French game that is not about France at all, because it's about Japan. That is called L'Empire des Cerisiers, so the Empire of Cherry Trees. That is a game that is set in medieval Japan with magic and so on, so it's kind of fantasy. It has a lot of interesting messages in it, because the author is like an historian, so he really knows well the history of Japan and of the different people in Japan. It's kind of a medieval fantasy game, but still you have this will from the author to integrate the different people of the Japan, like, the ancient people, the Ainu and so on, to integrate other maybe things that happened more recently in Japan, like in the 19th century, like a feminist movement in Japan, and it's kind of integrated back into the settings. So there are a lot of, I would say, of course, the political structure of the setting of the game is feudal. So you have a lord and an emperor and so on. But still, you have a lot of social issues that are raised by the game on a lot of different topics. So yes, I would say this game is interesting about that, because it's kind of melting like traditional game, really medieval fantasy. Also, it's set in Japan with also some maybe modern concerns, and also kind of a will to account for the long and complex history of Japan and of its different cultures.
Yeah, and I'm thankful that you talk about this game, because I noticed the game, and it's the one kind of bigger French game we haven't talked in any interview about, so I'm glad to hear about it. Yes, I'm almost through with my questions. Do you want to say something about your blog? Is that about role-playing games too?
Yes, it's about role-playing games, but it's mainly, it started as like some thoughts and sometimes some advice also on TTRPG, but now I mainly use it as like devlogs. So when I develop a new game, especially a game with specific mechanics, like, for example, Papillon Tonnerre, I talked about it. So this one, I talk about the different play tests and the different stages of the development of this game on the blog. Mainly now it's that. So it's kind of theoretical, and I don't know if it's interesting if you're not designing games, but it's kind of to be a will to show the process of creating a game.
And finally, for this part, I talked to an indie publisher with an author who writes hyper-localized games.
Hi, Moritz. So I'm Linou, and I started role-playing games when I was actually not really a teenager, because I was probably 11 or 12 when I started role-playing games. And that was quite the serendipity of life, which got me into RPGs, because at that time I was just reading some cool stuff, mostly fiction. James Herbert, Poe, Shelley, Lovecraft, of course, and thrillers and horror books, because I was already very interested in horror stuff. And one of my friends at school, his big brother, who had Dungeons and Dragons. I don't really remember what edition it was. I guess that was the red box. We tried that. We did not really understand what we were doing at the time. I was quite lost with that game, but something happened. I told myself, whoa, so we can actually mix the joy of reading and getting to know some exciting stories, but also having the power to change our destinies inside these stories. So I was quite excited, even if I did not really understand everything. Yeah, from that point, I read some, I don't know in English, livres dont vous êtes le héros.
Choose your own adventure.
Yeah, that was also a very big step. And from that point, I guess I never really stopped. I tried to know more and more about RPGs. I bought my first one when I was around, I guess, 14 or 15. Weird, because it was a very old one, which is called Thoan, Thoan. Very, very old one. Not even my generation, but I didn't even find this one in a shop. It was during a flea market. So that was my first bought RPG. And from this one, many came after this one. I was a big player of Call of Cthulhu for years, and all the World of Darkness and Cult. And then, of course, Delta Green. And then a few years later, when I was at the beginning of high school and also beginning of university, I tried some more indie games and French indie games. And I discovered so many great authors and script writers like Ino, Y-N-O, The 12 Monkeys. So many good stuff. And I'm still in this game right now, and I still love it. So that's cool.
You mentioned a lot of horror games like Call of Cthulhu, World of Darkness, Cult, and these are set more or less in the real world. So if you played them, would they be set in France or somewhere else?
Well, it depends. For a while, I played in Chicago for Chicago by Night quite a long time. And I played Orpheus as well, which was set in the US. So I played in the US. But otherwise, I always tried to make my campaign set in France. So I wrote some private stuff for my games, which was in Paris or even in the very small cities where I've been during my teenagehood. But most of the time, the first campaign that I played the official ones, and it was actually set in the USA. So I kind of traveled to the USA in my mind, even if at the time I never went there. It quite changed. Now I'm more about the local history, the local settings. But at the time, I was a teenager and I did what the books were offering to me at the time.
I want to focus a bit more on that, though. In the 1990s and early 2000s, were there any French-specific supplements for these games?
Yes, actually, I think so. I don't know everything, but I guess the one which is about the Dark Age was quite specific about Paris and France, if I'm correct.
There was an add-on created by Ludis, which was a French publisher. They created a France by Night. But it was kind of clunky because it was not actually official. It has been retconned afterwards. But yeah, there was a lot of enthusiasm by the time to create local stories. And indeed, now, like 3 or 4 years ago, when the new edition of Vampire Dark Ages came back, there was a book for France, dedicated for France and created by French people in collaboration with, I think it was Onyx Path now for Dark Ages.
Now we heard a second voice, so maybe you can also introduce yourself and tell us how you got into role-playing games.
Hello, Moritz. I'm Cédric. So I'm a little bit older than Linus. So I got into role-playing games a little bit earlier, like the end of the 80s, between 89 and 1990. In fact, my first contact was a bit earlier with game books, with Choose Your Own Adventure books. And I think the first one I discovered was Fighting Fantasy book, something about from Ian Livingstone, Steve Jackson, the really classic stuff. And I was so fascinated by two things: the illustrations, how the design and how the drawings and how the details, the small details in the pages were able to drag me in the world, in the story, in the narrative. And obviously, of course, the fact that I could exert some kind of control over the story. And I felt so compelled to just not die, which was basically impossible. But yeah, it was terrible. I tried not to cheat and, well, it was captivating. A little bit later, I found something that you must know very well. That's Schwarze Auge, the dark eye in English, l'œil noir in French. And it was sold, in a very generalist library. And the design of the package was exactly the same of Choose Your Own Adventure book, but it was a box with some characters you could cut and create. And there are a lot of small books and dice. It was like a treasure chest, And of course, I didn't understand anything about it. I had no clue if I needed other people to play with it or if I could do it on my own. It was very blurry and confusing, but exciting at the same time. I could feel the potential. I had no clue. Maybe I was, 10 or 11, something like that. And afterwards, a few years later, I think I was 13 and 14, I saw people in my school with some kind of sheets of papers drawn with a lot of scribbles and a maze and numbers written everywhere. And they seemed to be really focused on this. In fact, it was a dungeon, obviously, but with no rule whatsoever, no rule book. Everything was homemade. And I was in awe, in fact, when I saw that. And I said, what are you doing? Where does it come from? What's the deal? And I was absolutely flabbergasted by what I saw. When I understood what it was all about, something really opened in my mind. I said, okay, that's the big deal to me, because I was, it's not very original, but kind of solitary and reading. And I was involved really in the beginning of video games, it was really, really scarce by the time. And I said, okay, I can find something like that. And we talked about serendipity. It was exactly the same. I also stumbled upon a rule book of a game in a general store, nothing to do with gaming, or it was not even a library, And it was a revelation, because it was Star Wars from Western Game, which was to me, and still is to me, an example of what could be done to discover role-playing games. Maybe for how you play with rules, how you try to emulate a story, and how you tell a story, how you prioritize what you have to do in a story, the mood, the atmosphere, the characters, the humor, the tactical stuff, and how you can find a balance between all of these elements. I think this book was really life-changing. Even now, I think it's really, really subtle and perfectly balanced, just to explain to a newcomer how to play. And the first time I actually played role-playing game, I was game master. So the game really took me by the hand and just invited me in a really familiar, by the time, world to me, which was Star Wars, even if we only had the 3 movies, and that was all. And we filled the gaps with imagination, and the books were here for that. And so this was really the beginning for me. Star Wars D6, and after that, a lot of stuff. I was into Chaosium, Stormbringer. I discovered a bit later Call of Cthulhu, so it was possible to have something with more procedural and less action. The beginning was this one, and it never left me.
The old D6 Star Wars game has a weird role in my memory, because I remember reading the book, but I don't know if I've ever played it. And it wasn't one of my first games, but I do remember that it was quite well written. It had really good examples of how to do things. Yeah. But these examples you gave were all American games. Were there any French games that played a role for you in that time?
Absolutely, because in fact, even in these early times, we had some quite powerful and productive publishers. To me, there were mainly 2 approaches. There was something very classic, kind of poetic, fantasy, oniric. It was a game called Rêve de Dragon, Dragon Dream, by Denis Gerfaut. And it was really a landmark in the French role-playing game landscape, because it was something so well written, so detailed. The rules were very heavy and so on, but everything was so detailed and soft, and it was a cozy game. In fact, you just played people wandering through dreams in some kind of a blurry and shifting dream-like heroic fantasy world. But there was some kind of humor. It was very rural, local. You could spend a whole session just being in a tavern, eating, creating stuff. It was almost, The Sims. You could juggle or sing or do stuff. In fact, it was not a call for a big adventure. You were not here to save the world. You were just here to find a way to go to the next stop and maybe have a good time. And of course, solve the very strange problem of the locals, which are very absurd. There is something very nonsensical about this game. But all the details, all the immersion, it was really, really French to me. And on the other hand, there was the punks. And we had, you may have heard, I think, of the publisher, which was called C-Rose, and the game creator, Croc. He's the author of course, In Nomine Satanis, Magna Veritas, and all the games of C-Rose, Bloodlust, Heavy Metal, Bitume. It was always kind of violent. It was frontal, brutal. It was dirty, filthy, not very subtle. By the time it evolved, and sometimes you could find in the background, in the lore, in the setting, some things that were a bit more written and thought, like a game like Scales, for example, which was some kind of, I think, an attempt to emulate what the World of Darkness did in the rest of the world. But it was really a big player, because basically it was fun. You had a sword, which also was a god. you had a big car and you played Mad Max. You were an angel or a demon, just engage in the struggle between the two administrations with this Brazil-like and very absurd Terry Gilliam-esque approach of the struggle between heaven and hell. So, yeah, it was fun. It was from my early years. It was really important to me. Later, a publisher which was really important to me more by the middle 90s and afterwards, it's of course Multisim. Because Multisim, they created a game which was one of my favorite ever. It's Nephilim. And it really shaped in many ways my approach of writing as well.
Yes, I've seen a translation of it, but I don't remember if it was in English or German. Yes, I'm aware of that game. But let's not focus on historical games in France. Let's actually come to the games you've been working on, the two of you. So maybe Linou can hop in again and outline a few of your publications.
Yeah, sure. Like I told you, well, my approach quite changed with time. And after a while, I wanted to talk about stories which take place in France, but also in very specific regions, areas with their own folklore, traditions, history. So I quite wrote some of these games just for me and my friends for a while before I was sure it will be maybe interesting to share it with the world. So it took me some years before I felt confident enough to share these stories. So I started to sell my games on Roll20 on the marketplace. And I'm quite proud because I was the first French writer on the marketplace. And that was quite a neat experience. And people on Roll20 marketplace are very, very encouraging and the community is great. So it gave me the confidence to share my games. So first of the games that we published was actually chromatopsy, which is a very difficult word in every language because it's a disease. It's an eye disease, which makes people see. It's kind of a color blindness, but more about you see red and black and white. The story takes place in a non-realistic place near from the sea. And it's not actually in France. It's where you want it to be. It's just near the sea, near a lighthouse, and a very atmospheric game. And that was the first one. I'm not so proud because, well, that was the first one. So no, I guess that I would do some stuff differently. But I like this one because that was the first time that I allowed myself to implement what I call my touch, even maybe the French touch, because we're talking about French games. And this is a very dramatic story, which is centered on characters mostly, and the characters are very linked to the story. They are not pre-generated random characters. They are characters who are heavily involved inside the story from their backgrounds. And this is really something that I love and I want to explore more and more. So this one was the first one. And I was very surprised because, well, people quite liked it. And I was like, whoa, okay, that's a very small thing. And so I was very humble about it and very, unsure of myself. So, but apparently people liked it. So that was the first step. And from this one, many things happened because I told myself, okay, so if people like this, it means that I can go further into the exploration of the relationship between the characters. So let's not talk about the ones which are maybe not taking place in France, but there's several that I particularly like. But there's one which is very French, which is called Morituri te salutant, which means the deaf people saluting you. And it's a Roman saying, that's what the gladiator told to the emperor in the circus, during the games in the circus. And this one is very French and very dramatic because it speaks about the First World War in France. Because I actually come from a region which was very heavily shaped by the two wars, actually, the first and the second. And to me, all my childhood and my teenagehood were very, very shaped by these. I mean, there's kind of a memory work that we are all doing in this area of France. It's very important. We all have family who died during these wars. And also even the landscapes changed because of the trenches. And you see the trenches today they're still there and you can see it. And it's also a very beautiful landscape because it's raining. It's north of France. It's cold. It's raining. I mean, there's a lot of fog in the morning. And all these landscapes really had a very strong impact on me during my teenagehood. So I decided that I wanted to do something with that. And I created a game which actually takes place on the night of November the 10th, 1918. That's the day of the end of the war. And that's the last night of the First World War. So the story, I don't want to really reveal it all, but it is science fiction, but it is also historical. And it's actually a circle between the two of these influences, because you are going to discover the truth, which is awful, because the French generals, they forced French soldiers to fight and to die, even if they knew at the time that the war was over. But they did not let the people rest in the trenches. So they actually kind of sacrificed people for nothing. So that's a way to share that story, which is horrible, but it's also science fiction. And it's linked to all of our other stories. And I think that was one of the most intense and emotional stories that I wrote. And it's still very special for me. So this one is quite French and very specific. I'm actually from Picardy, but the game takes place in Les Ardennes.
Yes, as a German, I know this region. But like the battle in the Second World War, which in English is called Battle of the Bulge, in German is called Ardennen Offensive.
Ah, okay, yeah. And maybe just let's speak about another one, which is very, very French. It's Orphans, literally Orphans. Well, I kept the title in English because I think that was very easy for everyone to understand. And there again, it's a very French game, because I speak about my region again, but not during the war, during many different historical periods. So this one is maybe the most horrific games that I wrote. So it's not for everyone. I clearly want people to pay attention to your own safety because this one is quite harsh to read, because it talks about how orphan children were used during different period of times in France as kind of slaves. I mean, they work in industries. They were used to sew on machines. They went to the mines. And also it speaks about famines and how they did not had enough to eat during winter. They didn't had even a heating system during winter. And all these horrible things, you discover that in a very, very deep story, which takes place in my own village. I just wrote the setting is my own village where I lived for several years. And it's quite nice because you can actually discover the local history. Everything's true. And if it's not because I needed to add some things to get the game more dramatic, then you will know, because I always write a note for people to know, okay, so maybe this is not exact, but this is what I changed. So you would know. And at the same time, it's again very dramatic and emotional, because the players, they play characters which are emotionally very, very linked to the story as well. So not only they discover something which is quite sad and harsh, but also they have to find their way to a kind of redemption during this story. So these two are very, very French. And we are actually working together with Cedric right now, because I wrote something which is a historical game, which takes place in Jura Mountains. And it's not in shops yet, but it will be during summer or maybe in next September, because we are actually finalizing it. The text is okay. And we are now working on illustrations and things like that. So here again, it's very French because it takes place in 955, which is a dark Middle Age. And it's very French, and it will actually tell a story about a real place located in French history as well. So, yeah, I did not write only French games, but I like it. And one of my first inspiration is the places where I lived and the history, the big one. I mean, history with a big H. I think that's what I like the most.
This is very inspiring to me because while I grew up in Germany, I was never really part of the German role-playing scene, and I mostly bought English stuff. And then I thought about, could I write anything very German? And then I thought, well, maybe something about my hometown and super localizing it and thinking about the weird stuff in my hometown. So this sounds very interesting. And if I understand the things on the website right, these are scenarios, or do they also have their own rules?
There are scenarios and they come with their own rules, but maybe I let Cedric explain that because he's better than me explaining how the articulation between our system, which is a homemade system for all our campaigns and scenarios, works. And so go for it, Cedric.
The main idea was to, at first, we are focused on stories. We are focused on adventures. And what Linou is doing most of the time and from now, like compact and short stories, really intense and actually related to the characters, as she said before. When I read these adventures, the characters are like additional chapters of the story. They're really intertwined into the story. So we didn't want to be too system heavy on the approach, just to keep the pace, to keep the dramatic tension of the story, and just to have a system able to vanish behind the action. So we designed a very simple system, which is kind of diceless if you want, but you have a few resources to manage. It's just based on 9 attributes, which are all the ways you have to interact with the story and the environment, period. No complicated skills, no, just 9 approaches. You can endure, you can go past, you can know, you can use, you can feel, you can influence. So these are some kind of large catch-all capacities that give some kind of flavor to the character. There is no possibility to actually have a detailed build in order to have a Pathfinder-like experience. It's absolutely not the idea. The idea is more to have an overall flavor of what you can do. Of course, there are numbers, and most of the time, it's really basic. The basic approach is, if you have enough, it's enough. You do it. If you don't have enough, maybe you will have to spend something. Maybe you will have to change the conditions to improve your performance at this time. Maybe your own profile and history and background can help you, or you can rely on the die. In this specific case, just to convoke some alia in the story, to take a risk and to see if you can be better than what you would be naturally. So it's very simple. There is even a lighter version. The system is called Dirty System because it's about the name of the label, which is Dirty Clean Crew, Dirty System. And there is an even lighter version with 2-page, and it's fully diceless. And the idea, because if I have to come back to the initial question, the idea is the system is always given with the adventures. In fact, if you download the scenarios as PDF, you have a zip archive with the system, the full system, the light and the normal, in fact. And if you buy a paper version, you have a link and a QR code. You just have to flash it and you will download the PDF version of the system. In fact, we don't want to sell systems. We just want people to enjoy the game, to be able to sink and to plunge into the adventure without questioning, how will I play this? What do I have to learn? And no, in fact, you have a story, you have the system, you can play. And that's the idea, the reason why it's linked on our website and our products all the time. It's for free.
And Cedric, you are also involved in the layout and the illustrations, aren't you?
Yes. So in the label, so what we are doing with Linou, I'm taking care of the layout of some illustrations and in fact the packaging and giving a shape to the final product. I worked on a bigger project a few years ago, which was called Knots or knock. It depends. It was a dystopic sci-fi dark RPG, something quite massive. And I took care of the writing of some parts and mostly the design, the layout of the books. We could say artistic direction, the overall flavor of it. And my take on this point is that I think we really have the possibility with the layout to inject some unwritten lore, unwritten flavor, even if it's not illustrations, even if it's not, full page warrior or architecture or city. I think we can have some seeds of stories, some clues. I like to inject Easter eggs and some things to decipher, maybe to connect between 2 pages or even 2 books, and sometimes 2 different games, because you can create connections and links. I like really the idea that you can read the background of the pages and see some details or signs or symbol or half deleted, half erased writings that give you an information, a clue for the people who are patient enough to pay attention to this kind of thing. So this is a game in the game, in fact. And I also convinced that when you don't have the budget to have top-notch illustrators, you have a lot of ways to convey a visual identity to what you are doing. It could be just a background, it could be a margin, it could be something, a stamp in the background or stuff like that. It can be really subtle, it can be simple. And that's the reason why we are totally against AI use in role-playing games, because we don't buy the excuse. We don't buy it. We don't pretend to be a AA or AAA or anything like that, because we are pretty convinced, actually convinced, that there is no point to try to pretend to be something we're not, even if it's unnecessary, because a big time illustration won't make your game any better. It won't make the story deeper. It won't make the emotions you feel with the players more intense. But maybe you would have the feeling that you have marketed your product correctly. We don't want to actually market our products. Maybe it's a bit French, because we are talking about the French approach. We see, and don't get me wrong, it's not to be arrogant or anything, but I really value the idea of craft. It can be imperfect, but it can be perfected. And you try to do it on your own. You learn, you fail, you do it better the next time. And I think people can be aware of it, and they can understand this, and even they can recognize the value of this approach. So when I'm creating the designs, the layout, I always keep this in mind. In fact, to be respectful of the other artists who deserve to be paid for things we don't know how to do. So we do something else. And when possible, we hire artists to populate as well our books. Well, it was my take on the layout. For me, it's not just making the book printable or sellable. It's also, in a way, some kind of manifesto.
I'm a bit confused because you said something about not being the best artist, but then you also wrote to me that you did illustrations for one of my favorite games, so you also illustrated an international game. That's what I wanted to ask you about.
If we are talking about Cult from Almas Games, yes, since last year, in fact, now I'm doing a little bit more than the layout and so on. Yes, I'm creating illustrations in specific moods. I'm really into, just to put it simple, dark, liminal, symbolic architecture, to put it, and spaceships, but it's not the point. And yes, in fact, I've been contacted to contribute to the Metropolis sourcebook, will be released, I think, this year. I was commissioned to create views of Metropolis. It's not layout. It's for this time, it's actual A4 city illustrations. So I think there are like 10 of them right now and still going. So yes, I had the opportunity to work with Peter Nalo from Almas Games, and to create views of cities, of Metropolis. And as a big fan of brutalism, of David Lynch, of these gloomy, industrial, sad and empty atmospheres with a lot of texture and fog, I'm a fan of concrete and rusted metal, It's a bit odd, but this kind of stuff is really interesting me. And it was also at the time when I was not creating illustrations, it's when I shifted from graphic design to illustration, because there was some kind of porosity behind them. And I also like to create symbols, totems, symbolic figures, So they don't require actually tremendous drawing skills, but more to have a backstory behind them, to have an explanation. It's world building by image. We often talk about this with Li Nu. It's really a take that we love in a lot of media. It's the show don't tell. And just to have this kind of glyphs or elements or figures, they are strange, they are not self-explanatory, but you kind of guess that there's something behind. And that's something that we are doing, reason why I was really glad to work on Metropolis. Because what we're doing as well is we like to create stuff that are not self-explanatory, but they are all connected by some details, visual details, names. This is absolutely not necessary to play the game or to understand anything. But if you play Chromatopsy, then Orphans, then In Vino Veritas, then all the games, adventures we are creating, there is always a link. And often this link is visual. And it's not just for aesthetic reasons. It's because in my approach of layout and graphic design, I'm strongly convinced that the image, symbol, and words are kind of the same thing. So that's what we try to do. That's why I also, back in the days, created a small game about ancient Egypt. You know, the hieroglyphs were everywhere. So it was, I think it infused a little bit as well.
And just because I don't want you to devalorize your artwork, you can draw actually with a pen. And he's quite good with crayons as well, but he never wants to say he's good with a crayon. So I do. You're good with a crayon as well. I consider myself quite lucky. The label is quite lucky to have Cédric for the layout and illustrations, because he actually emphasizes all my ideas. It's really not going anywhere without Cédric's vision on the text. The text is there, but if you want to make a good game, I think that would be not enough. So I think our team is quite cool. Thank you.
What makes us French in the end, as writers or designers? I just have the feeling, considering the fact I've seen some publishers rise and fall during the last decades, I think there is in France an attachment to the design, to the visual storytelling. Try to make sure to have a cohesive approach, to create something consistent and polished. I witnessed that in the past, and when I saw games like, for example, Nephilim from the publisher Multisim, it was really, really impressive to see the quality of the products and the fact that each page was an invitation to just sink into the story, into the lore. And I think another aspect is that a lot of French games, I think, have some kind of really elaborate lore. Sometimes too much, but it's a marker of what we can see. You know, for example, De Genesis, so it's German, but De Genesis really has, I think, a French flavor in its approach. It could have been maybe a French game. At our level, I'm keeping in mind this approach. I'd like to try to do something in the idea that we're trying to polish things with the means we have, even if we have to say humble, but now in a really short formats. And what I like is the possibility to have really short adventures, short books. You know, you have everything in 20 or 24 pages. Everything is in it, but you have your package, you have your story, you have characters. It's nice. And there is a flavor and some hints of connections with other stories. Yeah, it's like the French touch in a nutshell, very humbly. That's what we try to do.
Yeah, they're quite impressive, the sample pages I saw on the website. And I thought, oh, why did I take 7 years of Latin and not French in high school? And well, I was like, okay, at least when my kid will go to high school, then I will convince my kid to learn French. And then I have a reason to learn it finally for other French role-playing games. But speaking of language, are there any plans to translate any of it into English?
Wow, that's a very good question. And you're not the first who asked it. So I'm not sure every adventures and scenarios or short campaigns that we did are interesting for international public and readers and players, because who wants to play in my hometown in France? I mean, maybe French people only. But I also have some more international stories like Deepwater Horizon, which takes place on the Deepwater Horizon petrol platform offshore rig.
Yeah, I've run case studies about that at university.
So maybe this one or the one which are more far from the very French local regions and history, that would be interesting. But so far, it's not really a priority because we have lots of work to do on the next games we want to finish. And I'm also creating new games right now because locally, I want to work with my shop, which is just in the next city, a few kilometers away from my home. And I want to be able to share big games with them, organize games with restaurants, and, for kids during vacation with the cities and the people who are involved into taking care of children and schools and everything. So I'm more focused on working locally than internationally. But it's not the first time that someone asked me that, especially for Roll20 market, because they would like to have the games translated to be able to sell them to the US market, because for now they're sold to the Quebec and French people, but not to the US market. So yeah, maybe one day, but we are a very small label. We don't have so much time. And I'm not sure it's one of our priorities right now. My priority is also to develop more than stories, because I've got good friends in the label, because we are an open label. I mean, Cedric and I are the founders, but we have friends also who are working with us, and they are all very good author, creators, illustrators, and all these ideas is just so cool. And I really want to grab all the ideas and do some new things. My big stuff right now is to write games without game master. That's really my focal point right now. I really want to do that. And maybe not stories, but really some mechanism and rules which are cool to play very deep emotional stories without game master. This is what I want to do right now. So, translation is not for now, but if one day we are maybe a little bigger and we feel that someone could be interested abroad, maybe. I don't think it's a priority. Maybe talk about conventions, because there's a good chance that maybe we see each other, we cross each other with other players, maybe even German players in the future, because we are trying to find a good place to go. And maybe that's going to be Kaisersberg, which is in Alsace. So if we go next year, maybe that's going the place to be, and maybe the place where we can all meet together if some people want to meet with us. Because there's a lot of conventions in France. We do not go to each of them because that would be very tiring and very time consuming and resources consuming. But maybe Kaisersberg will be the next one. We want to invest in it and to be there. So it's not that far from Germany, actually. Depends where in Germany, because Germany is very big, actually. But
So thank you for listening to part 2 of episode 28, and let's get to part 3 to round this episode off. But before I let you go, I just want to give a short list of the French RPGs that have been translated into English. The older ones from the late 80s and 90s are Agon, Nephilim, In Nomine. In French, it's called In Nomine Satanis Magna Veritas, but the English version is just In Nomine. And then Qin the Warring States from the early 2000s. And more current ones are Night and Avalon RPG, Cats the Conspiracy, and Worm. And as for indie games, a couple of indie authors also write in 2 languages, in French and in English. So, for example, Thomas Meunier, who will be in part 3, recently got Dragonfly Motel translated. It's not out yet as of this recording, May 2026, but he has some other work available in English. And then there's Com Martin, who wrote a game called Broken Cities, which I think is the only French game I ever read in the English translation. All right, that's it for now, and we'll hear us again in part 3.